Hello and welcome to this video, guys. Today we're going to look into HostBinding and HostListener. They are two decorators provided by Angular that enables us to interact with the host elements of a directive or a component. So let's get started. Let's get started by actually generating a directive. So ng generate directive. Let's call it my directive in this case. Naming does not really matter. So once this is generated, we'll jump straight into it. So now that we have our directive here, we can just get started with. The first thing we want to talk about is the host binding. So the host binding allows you to bind a property of the directive or the component to a property of the host element. So in this case, we're using a directive, so we could just go ahead and say host binding. Host binding, and here we can pass in the style, for instance, color, we can say background color, and then we could give it a default value if we wanted to. We could say this is going to be a default empty string, and we need to import the host binding from Angular core as well. So now once we have this, there is essentially we're going to be able to attach this to whatever component we want it to be attached to, or whatever HTML component we want it to be attached to. So in this case, we could go to an app component. We could say here in the app component, we're going to say div, and within the div, we're going to attach the directive to the div. So in order to do that, go to the directive selector, copy the selector, and place it here. So we'll put the Chrome next to this so that we can preview it all together. So now that we have them side by side, we should be able to say my div, and then it should appear under the logo type. And as you can see here, let's just go ahead and add some margins to it so that we can preview it a bit better. We can say div margin 40px. So we'll have some margins so that we can see them my div in a better way. So it's attaching a background color, which we set to be an empty string. So we could say, for instance, let's say here in the constructor, we're going to give it the background red. We're going to give it the background yellow. So what really happens is that it binds the background color to the host element where it's being attached. So in this case, it binds it to the div element. All right, so in this way you can bind a couple of different things. You can manipulate the way it should look like, manipulate the way it should behave with the host bindings. So you're binding essentially a style to a certain place, in this case the HTML div that we had in the app component. This is what host binding is. Also keep in mind you can do this programmatically, meaning that you can decide when it should be applied and when not. So you could have input properties. In this case we can have an input property here. We can say let's call it apply color equals to false. So here we can say if this dot apply color, if apply color is true, then we can apply the background color. So now it's default false, so we can say apply color, we can give it the true value, we need to have the square brackets here, and we also need to move it obviously to the ng on init, because the on init. Alright, so let's go ahead and import it. Let's also go ahead and make sure we have it in the code, and now just replace the row with whatever we had. And you will see when we pass in true, now we're having some issues with prettier it seems, but if we're passing in true, as you can see here, it is in fact becoming yellow, and if we now decide to pass in false, it should not have any color at all. So in this way you can pass in properties to the directives in a similar way you would pass them into components. Keep in mind that now we're utilizing the directive. Also keep in mind that the host bindings essentially exist for components as well. So if we wanted to add it to, for instance, our header component that we had it, we could do so, and so on. You can also make sure, I think a more common case to utilize it, for me anyway, would be to maybe that you want to attach a certain clause to the parent container instance. So you could, for instance, you could set the disabled clause in this way. So if background color is true, it's going to attach this disabled clause. If it's false, it's not going to do it. So there are a couple of different alternative ways you could do it. So now that we have gone through the host binding, let's essentially look into the host listener. So what is a host listener? So in short, the host listener allows you to listen for events on the host element. So in this case, wherever we attach the app my, we will be able to listen for whatever we want. In this case, we're going to look into click events. So the way you would set this up within the code would be, you would have the host listener decorator, listener, and here we could go ahead and add, we're going to use the click. And keep in mind that we can pass in the events by having the passing it in within the square brackets in this way. And now we can have a function, so in this case onClick function. So this will make it possible for us to essentially pass in the event to the onClick listener, and now we should be able to listen for clicks on it. So whenever we press the div, we should have a console output showing that we are clicking on it, and it should also log the event that we have. So let's go ahead and click on it a couple of times, and you will see that we have a couple of click events. So just imagine what you can do with host listeners and host bindings. I think this is an awesome feature in Angular, but there are also some cons. So the pros of using host bindings and host listeners, as we have shown in this case, is it's easy to interact with host elements, and it's also better performance by using host binding and host listeners because you can avoid unnecessary property bindings and actual event listeners on child elements, which can improve the performance of your application. It can also give you improved flexibility with the decorators that we have, which essentially means that we can customize the behavior of our directives and components, which would allow us to create reusable and versatile Angular applications. So just imagine what we can do if we create a common directive that would be reused amongst the whole application. We wouldn't have to have too much logic on the actual component or like the use case per se. We could instead create a directive which we then could reuse in a similar way that we're using it now. All right, so what are the cons of using the host binding and host listeners? Obviously, it's adding some complexity to the code. You would have to know how they work and how they look like. The decorator syntax, which comes with Angular, it's quite default, and it's a powerful way to interact with the host elements that we have. But it's also limited compatibility with the host binding and host listeners. They're only available in Angular, which means they cannot be compatible with other frameworks or libraries, which is kind of bad. For instance, if we generate a web component or Angular elements, there might be some issues with this logic. And it could also be some conflicts using the host binding and host listener decorators because they could potentially conflict with other directives or components that use the same host listener that we have. So for instance, we're setting up a host binding and host listener here for the div component, but imagine now the div HTML tag instead would be a component which also would have set up the host listener and host bindings, and then we could have conflicts with both the component and the directive behaving in different ways for the event bindings that we have. And this would be I would say it's not very common use case where you have it in both places, but it could happen, and it could lead to unexpected behaviors, and it might take a lot of time for you to debug and so on. So to summarize this, overall, the host binding and host listener decorators, they are a very powerful tool to creating dynamic and interactive Angular applications. But it could be used in a way like, don't use them if you do not need them to be used in a certain way, because they could lead to potential issues and complications, as I have explained before. Thank you guys for watching. All of the best. Bye.